Okay.
Interesting. It's been interesting so far. It always is when Dragon Stock is on. Converse Contender is here as well. First time on my channel. I've enjoyed his. He's a seems to be a good dude. What's up, Converse Contender?
Okay.
Hey, how are
Have a
you?
nice
Am I
talk. Good night to
Good,
everyone.
good night.
Good night.
Thank you. Bye bye.
am I audible at all?
Yep.
Yep, we hear you.
All right, cool. Appreciate you inviting me on and Drag as well. Thanks to everybody for that, and I appreciate the opportunity. I kind of missed the whole conversation though, honestly, because I was I had my son today, and then I came home and got some dinner for my fiance and I, and we kind of been watching a movie. We just watched The Lincoln Lawyer, but I thought, hey, while it's getting toward the end of the night, I might go ahead and jump on for a little while to say what's up.
Well, if I can maybe kind of like just put us back where where they kind of the overarching theme here, and it has to do with we were talking about critical thinking earlier,
What
and
weight
that's
you
what.
well, you mentioned at the very beginning of this conversation what weight you put on your emotions matters when it comes to determining whether what you're doing is confirmation bias or critical thinking.
Yeah, the evaluation of our own biases that we try to put into when evaluating any proposition is true or not. And so we kind of went down and we were talking about the Kalam a little bit with Otangelo and the Adventist Hermes here. But the thing is, I think this is like I was saying, this is ad hoc kind of rationalization, ways trying to harmonize, beliefs that people have with the things that we know about reality, or things that we know about reality to a relatively high degree.
What is
But
the ad hoc? What is ad hoc?
well, I'm saying that it's like that. I don't think that a lot of people approach a lot of these arguments, like for example, the Kalam, as from the position of complete neutrality, and say just like, "Hey, that's a really good argument. I think I believe in the Christian God now."
It would be post hoc, I think, rather than ad
Gotcha.
hoc.
Sorry, post
Yeah.
hoc.
Well. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
because ad hoc would be kind of off the cuff, whereas post hoc would be, after the event, after the belief, after rationalization.
right.
That is correct. Sorry,
Well,
my apologies.
Well, one thing is, don't expect me to try and argue for the Kalam, because Drag will tell you. He's asked me, did I want to come on with Alex Malpass and defend the Kalam, and I told him that I don't really promote the Kalam because I think there's too much room to wiggle in it. So, for example, in one of the premises, the universe began to exist. I think there's too much room in there. I've heard everything from um, well, there could be some unknown natural thing that was preceded the Big Bang, or there could have been I've just heard too many things, too much wiggle room, so I don't go down that, because if I'm going to argue a deductive argument, I want my premises to be completely airtight.
Yeah.
And so while there may be some sorry so while there one more thing, while there may be some people, some philosophers that have that spend their time looking into all the objections and can handle all the objections to the Kalam. I do not spend most of my time doing that, so I'm just not the person to defend that.
Right.
Well, can I add? We have to ask the question about what's the difference between I guess, yeah, deductive thought process versus a post hoc process, because it sounds like the same thing to me. Like if you have a set of information, you don't know everything about something, then you're using deductive reasoning you're using some inference to come to a conclusion about things that you don't have flat out evidence. So
Right.
that's what
That's
Christians are doing when it comes to the information they do have, and then they start doing deductive thinking. You may consider post hoc as if it's a bad thing, but it's something that we all do in every field of science.
I don't think that the point that Socka was making was that a post hoc rationalization is necessarily a bad thing, and then that you correctly identified that would be the category, right, of what is happening, and then that's the technique that you had just mentioned of what is used to come to those conclusions. What the point that Socka was making is that that's not what made you a Christian. But that's what we always end up hearing, at least some of us as non-believers. We hear the post hoc rationalizations and not what actually brought you to the faith to begin with.
Well, and the answer
Well,
for most people that I've met was they grew up in it generally. Like you know, that's what brought me to Christianity when I was Christian, was I grew up in a Christian family.
Yeah, but I
Well,
haven't actually had that experience. Whenever I typically ask people, they don't typically say, "Well, because I was brought up in it." I mean, matter of fact, a lot of my friends were brought up in it, and they tended to leave the faith. So, for example, you could say I went to church with my grandma when I was a little kid, but my immediate family weren't really church going family like that. So, but I grew up more secular, playing in punk bands, skateboarding, this kind of thing. Just your normal, everyday secular style life. I mean, I did have my grandma that kind of tried to push me toward Christianity, and she was an awesome person. So, I always looked up to her. But I feel like whenever I came back, it was a lot of it was because of the person of Jesus and so on and so forth. But it wasn't necessarily because I was raised in it. And I understand that there may be some people. I've heard a lot more Muslims admit that it's because they were raised in it. But I haven't heard so much of that. But again, I don't think you're trying to make the genetic fallacy by saying how a belief originates, that therefore it's wrong. You're not doing that, right? You're just saying
No,
that
I
that
was just stating that that seems to be the most common thing, is that people are exposed to this idea through their upbringing. I've met a few people who were converted later in life, and almost all the pagans I know converted themselves later in life, because pagans don't proselytize generally. There are a few groups that do, but very, very, very few. Most of the Christians that I've met, on the other hand, did grow up as Christian, not in the least because we live effectively in a Christian hegemony to a certain degree. Like, our culture is very steeped in Christian tradition, and the majority of people in this country are Christian.
well,
sure.
I wanted to
Go
answer.
ahead.
I wanted to answer what's Dragnauct kind of clarified. He was saying that basically we come up with these explanations, but none of these explanations are the reason why we become Christians, which is a lot of these explanations aren't. But the reason why we talk about them is because a lot of atheists or non-believers would say, "Well, we don't believe because of this. This doesn't make sense, and I would believe if this made sense." So that's why we go through the thought process of explaining these things, so that it would make it easier for a person to at least be open-minded that, hey, this idea that they believe in could make sense in this realm that is bothering me. Like, I can't be a Christian because I don't understand how could God be timeless and then also create something. Like, we're trying to help you, at least believe this. If this is a little stumbling block, then we're trying to smooth it out. That's the reason why we talk about it.
Honestly, I don't want to hijack the conversation, so I'm going to say, if you'd like to come back on the channel sometime in the future, I'd love to have a conversation about how you think being a Christian would in some way help me. Just because the religion itself, the part of the reason I left it is because it doesn't. But anyway, go ahead, Dragnauct.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I want to answer that whenever you get done.
Yeah, no, I would actually. That's an interesting question, and that kind of actually is a better question than what I was going to get into. I have heard that before, that somehow Christianity is supposed to help people. I have plenty of anecdotes from people that is the case, and I won't deny that is something that I've heard time and time again. Even at my own university, it is almost put forth as a panacea of sorts. For people who have mental illnesses, to which I did actually inquire more and come to find out.
Don't get me into that.
And so, Alliakai, you and I share a very, very strong feeling about that sort of notion. And I actually, I have to ask, when you say that, in not so many words, that, adopting this belief system would help someone or benefit someone, what specifically do you mean by that?
Were you talking to me?
Yeah, or converse. It doesn't
Well,
matter.
Well, maybe I'll just say one thing here, is that I don't think that people should be looking for beliefs for their effect. I think that's maybe one reason, but I think you should only believe something if it's true, if it's the case. Now, we're going to justify things in different ways. So even if Christianity wasn't necessarily helpful to me, I would only want to believe it if it were the case. So there are many things that could be helpful to me depending on what my goal is. So, for example, if I had more of a hedonist view, I would not become a Buddhist monk because it would not. They teach to, a lot of them anyway, I should say, teach to cut off your desires and try to live a desire-free life and so on and so forth. So I wouldn't pursue that because it wouldn't help me in with my goals. But regardless of the goals, I would only want to believe something if it were the case and if it were in fact true. So I just wanted to say that first. But if it is,
there's a very interesting set of things that you could start getting into when you're talking about believing something because it's true, though. Because both the way in which the Bible came to be a full document as we understand it today, and many of the things in it, if not proven definitively false, are definitely not substantiated by a lot of the evidence that we have. So the idea of I would only believe something if it's true becomes very, very messy when you start looking at, for example, biblical scholarship and history and which of the, for example, Paul's letters are counterfeit and things of that nature. If you only want to believe things that are true, would a counterfeit letter from Paul then be a barrier to your belief in the Bible?
Only if that were the case. That would maybe that would at least say that those letters shouldn't be counted amongst the ones that. But I would just say that a lot of people who say that are not familiar with the criticism on the other side. So, for example, in textual criticism, the example you gave, you have the modern day textual criticism says it's what Bart Ehrman and a lot of Christian scholars as well buy into, and it basically says that we should go by the manuscript evidence that we get, and maybe by some of the early church fathers' writings, but mainly by the manuscript evidence that we have. So they look at like this very small few documents that are, let's call that they call the earliest manuscripts, for example. That is assuming. And I'm completely fine with the method that they use, but I'm just saying it's not the only method. So they're assuming in that those documents which have, for example, are missing a verse or two, that those are the oldest. One of the reasons is because they're shorter.
Okay, I think that there's a logical fallacy that you're applying here. You're assuming that, that the way that you phrase that, I'll backtrack a second. The way that you phrase that makes it sound like the scholars are assuming that these are the oldest documents because they're missing a verse or two, when quite often there's been dating methods done on them, the location and and areas in which they've been found, the period of time in which the dialects that they're written in come from. There's a lot of different ways that you can date something that have nothing to do with whether or not a verse is missing.
Yeah, I'm completely aware of that. Yeah, I wasn't resting my case upon that they only date them based on shorter versions that are missing. They said that it's more likely that they were added to than taken away, for example. So there are other dating methods. I'll give you, for example, one. There's a criteria called the Criterion of Embarrassment. And I'm sorry, not the Criterion of Embarrassment. That's a different, the criterion, or the expansion of titles, for example. Just to give you another example to show you that I do understand that. Expansion of titles, there are earlier versions that say something like our God, and there are later versions that say something like our great God. And they say it's more likely that they expanded the titles out of piety. So I do understand those things, but rather the argument that I was making, it has no bearing on that. It's just to say that there are ecclesiastical texts that are not, there are texts that are not found in what they call the earliest manuscripts, which are quoted from earlier than the manuscripts that we have by early church fathers, for example. And when they look at these, they tend to say that, well, maybe it was just a sermon homily. It was just saying something that was certainly like it. But for example, in my Ante-Nicaeans Volume 5 book for the Ante-Nicene Church Fathers, you have a quote from Cyprian in the 280s, I believe, saying...
Yeah, but I think that, like, quoting earlier manuscripts and determining which of the earliest manuscripts are not the only methods that I've heard used to determine that some of the letters of Paul were forged. There were also things like analyzing the style and rhythm and such of diction and other writing,
Sure.
which is something that you can actually do right now with a computer. There are programs where you can put in samples of somebody's writing or somebody's Facebook page or something like that, and it will find everything that they have ever written across the internet, including places where they attempted to deliberately change their writing style, because there are certain patterns to and rhythms to the way that we use language that are so subconscious it's nearly impossible to change them. And
Sure,
when
but
they've
Paul has
analyzed
admitted.
things from that level, then there have been several letters of Paul's that, in addition to the other evidence, that has also added to the conclusion that several of those letters are forged. And actually, Knock has done a lot of research on this topic, so if he wants to address it, like, he'd be a fantastic person to talk to about
Right,
this.
but Paul admitted to having an amanuensis, right? So I think that would definitely play a part in it, that Paul did have the what you'd call a literary assistant. So that would play a part in it, for example. But also, like I say, what you're reading are manuscripts though, of Paul's, and you might say, well, yeah, the literary style has changed a little bit, but the Bible admits in Paul's letters that Paul used an amanuensis, which is a literary assistant to help him with the writing.
Okay,
and
but all of
distribution.
those written letters would still have those same sort of similarities between them that, you know, his direct manuscripts would, and they don't.
Right, but
several of them have
but
a
keep
completely radically different than, you know, even if we were to assume there were two originators, some of them have such radically different styles to them that two originators would still not explain that.
right, but
And
keep in
again, that's not
mind.
the only evidence there is. It's just some of the evidence
Well,
that refutes your idea of the earliest manuscripts are the only argument.
well, no. I said at the beginning, I don't just think that they base it off of the earliest manuscripts, but keep in mind, as an atheist critic mentioned to me before, when I said they tend to say that these are the earliest, and he goes, yeah, but don't make the mistake that some people do and say that scholars say that these aren't Paul's writings. Rather, they say something like they seem to be different from his other writings, or they may not be original to Paul, but they do not state conclusively that these are not Paul's letters. So maybe you would want to use a different or better example that would show Christianity to not be true, rather than something that could or could not be the case. For example, with Paul's writings, or the method by which they were copied through manuscripts, or so on and so forth.
I actually don't know much about the letters, so Ali, me and you are going to have to talk about that. I take issue with the fact that Paul announces himself an apostle and claimed to have divine word from Jesus himself. And I take a lot of issues with Paul, but I don't know this particular issue, Ali. And my research on Paul is incomplete. I keep putting it off because stuff like tonight happens, and now I learned something new, and now I got to go look into this shit.
Well, I'm sure y'all
Well, if
know
you want,
other
I can get some
examples.
sources from Chris as well, because Chris
Yeah, I got to
has
still
a
talk to
bunch
Chris,
of
and I want to talk to
stuff
Dr.
that are-
Josh.
Who,
Yeah.
Monty, or
No,
No, they're different.
Chris used to be
Well-
biblical history skeptic, though she's
Doc-
been on a hiatus.
Oh yeah, Dr. Josh.
Time.
Not. I don't want to talk
Yeah,
to Dr.
I
Josh
was about
about
to
this.
say
I want
he's
to talk
an
about
Old
Dr.
Testament.
Josh about it, an overview of my history shit that I'm trying to do.
Gotcha.
I mean,
So,
honestly,
but I'm sure
there
you can come up with other
are tons
examples.
and tons of other like historical examples of things that very clearly did not happen. There's no
Sure.
evidence of, you know, Jewish enslavement, for example, in Egypt.
Well, I would. Did you want to? I'm sorry if I interrupted you.
No, like that's one of the big ones. Also, you know, things having to do with the Red Sea and the fact that there's absolutely zero evidence of any sort of crossing of the Red Sea. Things of that nature. Like there are a lot of stories in the Bible that that could not possibly have happened. There's
the
geological
global
evidence
flood
of a global
has
flood
been thoroughly
either.
debunked, and
Well,
that's usually my favorite
there's-
go-to in these arguments. Is the global flood has been debunked since like the early 1800s or late
Okay,
1800s,
there's a
something
few
like that.
things. Right, there's a few things there. So, for one, I would want to know in I'm sorry, your name if I mispronounce it. Alec.
Call me Ali if you have a hard time with my name. It's
Okay.
it's Haida.
I had a hard time with her name at first.
Yeah, it's
Ellie?
Alliakai.
Is that Hawaiian?
It's Haida. It's a sort of weird English version of Alliakai, which means Lady of the Dogfish House.
Okay. All right, because I just got back from Hawaii a couple months ago, and I heard a lot of names that sounded similar. But anyway, yeah. So with your example, I would just ask, like, what archaeological evidence or what kind of evidence are you talking about for the Red Sea, for example? And then with Nakasuchi, I would just point to the fact that I don't actually buy into a global flood. I buy into a regional flood.
Yeah,
And
and that's a good
Well,
apologetic,
and to be
that's
honest, the regional
a good one.
flood is far more likely. Like, there is some evidence that a regional flood may have happened
Yeah,
in Fertile
there were
Crescent, and a lot
multiple
of stories may
regional
have
Yeah.
happened. But the thing is, though, when you start talking about
I think the
truth,
time
the Bible
periods are a
says
little
that it
messed
was
up.
a global flood.
When did it say that? I mean,
Well,
I'm
it says that it said
like John
that
Walton,
the
for example, who's a scholar. He says that that it's his model is a regional flood, and he's a Semitic language, like he's an expert in ancient Semitic study. So I would just say that, for example, he and Dr. Michael Heiser, who's also an ancient Semitic language expert, they both accept the regional flood and say that that's more likely the model. But what they do is they base it off of, number one, the text, but also their closest neighbors and their text. And so basically they take a more scholarly approach. Now, there are terms, for example, where you would say something like, it like the flood, I don't remember the exact terminology, but it covered the whole world or whatever it may be. But obviously the term world is used, cosmos is used in multiple places to not mean the entirety, but rather something like the known world, where it's used to mean something like that. So I would just look to them for your resources on that material to show that it's not just like I'm making up something, but rather they have literature to back up what I'm saying.
Oh yeah,
And
I've definitely heard this before, and it's because I think the timing gets messed up, but there was a regional flood in that area, but it was
Yeah.
considerably before the Genesis story. But yeah, anybody else feel free to pipe in. I know we've been kind of ranting and rambling.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I believe in a global flood, and I believe the evidence. I mean, talking about how there's people from different backgrounds who don't really have connections, having this global flood tradition. You may say, well, in their tradition, it didn't mention the whole world, but nevertheless, the idea of making a boat versus just moving to the closest mountain or just moving to a different land. That would make more sense than creating a boat, if that was the case.
Well, by regional, I can mean the entire Persian Gulf. I don't have to necessarily mean like just one little village or something.
Well, even that, but we still know that these people walk and they travel great distances. I mean, they could travel a great distance if they were told by God that you have to prepare for.
Well,
a
it doesn't
flood.
say they were told by God. It says that Noah was told by God.
Yeah, Noah. So
in all fairness, yeah, they could travel great distances, but I mean, it took them 40 years to make a trip that you could walk in like 8 days. Like
Well,
now.
That's
well, exactly. So it took them 8 days. It could have taken them 8 days, right? So if they could have taken just like 8 days, or like, let's say a whole month, where God in the text gave them 120 years, he could have definitely gone somewhere to get away from the flood.
Okay, but if you're talking about the boat, though, like, not to bail converse Contender out, but at the same time, there have been a number of things done on the Ark, and with the dimensions given in the text, it could not have floated. Like, it was not a device that would have functioned on water.
Well, okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, here you may have to give some special pleading, considering that God is in control of the flood. But there's different ways, like considering how insanely destructive the flood had to be to destroy the whole world.
Why would you give such incredibly specific numbers of how big and exactly what dimensions this boat was if it would take God power to, like, float it? That doesn't make a lot of sense on the part of the authors.
Well, see, the thing is, God doesn't tell us to do things that he tells us things to do what we can. He wants us to play our part. He doesn't do everything for us. He could have just put them in like a bubble and not have him make a boat. But God wants us to do everything.
Why?
Well, because he didn't make us to be lazy.
Okay, that doesn't make sense.
I would say that God uses means. So, for example, if I made a video game in order to produce some effect in the video game, I would use a mod. I wouldn't just snap my fingers. For example, I would use, if I created a material world, I would use the material world as my means to an end. For example, so I just used the fact that God uses means of the world to produce effects in the world.
Yeah,
Yeah, but again, that still comes back to that particular boat would not have floated.
Well, how do you know? Wait, what do you mean? What part of it would not float?
The sheer weight of the material, among other design flaws in the way that it said that it is constructed, it would not be capable of floating on water.
Oh wait. What's the weight size? I mean, because there's boats that are made out of pure metal. What are you talking about? What do you mean?
Hey, so okay, so obviously we're not gonna we can agree that wood and steel are have different strengths, right? Like that you'd have to use a lot more wood to equal the strength of steel, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about floating, or it?
Yeah. So you take it from the perspective of somebody who sails for a living. Do you know how thick the metal on most ships are?
Pretty thick, I imagine.
No, less than half an inch.
Well, I'm sure they're heavy. I'm sure. Let's say I'm sure it's heavier than wood, though.
Yeah, well, but that's the thing is that if you want something to be strong, okay, so if you have a large ship that's made out of metal, okay, you can keep metal relatively thin because steel itself is very strong metal. And plus, you get a lot of good things out of steel as well. Is that with most metals, it can twist. That they can actually absorb some of the effects of the ocean on it. Like I've sailed in hurricanes before. Like it's not an enjoyable experience, and I wouldn't want to do it on a wood boat. Now, if you wanted to make something strong, okay, but the only material that you had access to was wood, okay. If you wanted to keep that comparable or to the strength that you would get from a steel ship, it wouldn't be a straight, okay, well, we're going to make it, this thick. We're going to make it as thick as we'd make a steel ship. You'd have to make it thicker. But because it's also a weaker material, if you wanted to equal the strength that you'd have from steel, it wouldn't. You'd have to use more wood. In the end, to keep something made of wood, to keep it as strong as it could to survive those seas, with the same type of strength that you get from less than half an inch of steel, you'd have to use more wood. In fact, you'd have to use more wood that would weigh more than the steel itself. And then you run into a bunch of other logistical problems with this, with the fact that, like I said, is that when a wooden ship, especially once it gets to a certain size, like the proposed by the arc there, when it twists, what happens is that the wood doesn't have the same type of give that metal has, especially when it's built that thick. So when it's built that thick, and to equal that strength that can survive, certain sea states, like a violent storm that lasts 40 days, you're going to be talking about something that has a weight that would weigh more than the same ship would have made of steel.
And that's not even talking about the way in which it would have to be designed, which, again, the dimensions and such of it are given in order to hold the weight of every single animal on Earth.
That's just kind of part of the issue. There's also a bit of an issue with where did all the water come from, and why
there's
hasn't the world?
A lot of issues.
There's a huge issue with the fact that you have more water than actually would presently exist on the Earth, and that the amount of energy it would take in order for it to rain enough for it to do that would literally cook the Earth. But there's
but if maybe I could add something to that. So I typically point to Michael Heiser and John Walton's book, like John Walton's book on the I think it's called something like The Lost World of the Flood or something like that. So I don't have all the answers to the biblical. So like if you could bring up like multiple passages where I'd have to go into the ancient languages, and so I would just point to the ancient language experts on that. But with your point about Well, hang on a second, because if you think about it, like there's all kind of barriers in the natural world to these things occurring. Even on a regional flood, I think you would be more obliged to say, okay, then it makes more sense on a regional flood. But still, there could be even natural problems with that as well in nature. But I think when we're if we're looking at the text as like, because I could be convinced that there was a worldwide flood, like I could be convinced, but I'm just not convinced. But either way, I look at this as another miracle claim, right, from the Bible. Now a lot of times we look at miracle claims and go, well, hang on a second, because it seems that miracle claims seem to be all over the place, right? But the Bible's kind of like ESPN highlights, like it just gives you like the reason why they wrote them down, like they didn't write down some of the normal things, for example. But if we're looking at the flood as, like a miracle claim or like some type of supernatural claim, I think that for the God that created the universe, like it would be, I know you would agree that it'd be trivially easy for God to create a flood or something like that. For example, if we're just doing an internal critique and just looking at the worldview in which this comes out of, that wouldn't
sure.
be necessarily difficult. But I get your point about um, the effects of the flood. So,
Well,
for example, on the global scale, one more thing here, on the global scale, like you would wonder, like, well, if the whole world was flooded for that long, like, what did the animals eat when they got off the ark, for example, and things like that. So, like, I can understand like some of the questions that would arise, but like in the actual what happened, I think we could, obviously you could look at the worldview and say, well, if God created the universe, it'd be trivially easy for him to flood the earth, for example.
right.
Right,
So
but the problem with this, sorry, Drake, can I
go ahead. Go ahead, man.
Yeah, the problem with this is that once, and I don't want to demean it, like when we talk about miracles, like it almost seems like we're just talking about magic, but like the issue with this
I
is that
mean,
when
I
you
have yet to have found a Christian who can explain the
hold on,
difference between
sorry,
miracle and
hold on,
magic.
Allie. The issue with that is that you are weakening, any type of explanatory position automatically once you invoke any type of miracles into it. When you have the suspension of natural laws in this
You're
way,
weakening what?
you're weakening any explanation, because yeah, you're right. If you could propose an omnipotent being that can do absolutely anything, it could do things this way, it could do things that way, it could explain everything, as well as it could explain the counterpoints, the counterfactuals of all those things as well. You literally have something that can explain absolutely every scenario, as well as the scenarios that would contradict the original scenario that you're trying to explain. When something has absolute explanatory power,
Sure.
it has no explanatory power.
Sure. Well, yeah, Leonard Susskind said something like that about the multiverse. He said something like, theory that explains everything explains nothing. So I can see where you're coming from, but my point was simply that when we're looking at these things, for example, like if I come to an atheistic worldview, I can't go, well, where's God at in your worldview? What I'm saying is, if we come to a theist worldview, which has supernatural implications, we need to look at things that are, said to be miracles, and then we need to go, okay, so if I'm going to critique this from an internal critique perspective, like which a lot of people, philosophers want to do as to be consistent, then they go, like, here's what I like to say, like when somebody asks me about miracles and they go, you know the laws of gravity, the laws of nature, and you believe a guy could walk on water, and then like literally walk on water, and then I like to say things like, I like to say, no, that is a stupid claim if your worldview is correct and natural, like there are only natural things, for example. If it's the case, but the Bible's claim isn't that Christ naturally walked on water, the claim is more likely something like the God that created the laws of nature, it's trivially easy for him to walk on water, for example. So all I was pointing out is not that that is a great explanation from a critical point of view, but rather when Drag brought up the flood and what about the natural implications of the flood, I was just pointing out that, well, hold on, because on an internal critique view, you want to take the worldview that you're, in a supernatural thing. Now you might say, well, hold on a second, but I don't believe in supernatural, or there are other objections outside of that. But just to that one point, like explaining a miracle, of course, if the claim is that somebody naturally walked on water, you can go, well, no, we know the laws of physics, but that's not the claim. You get that, right?
Yeah, I do get that. I'm just saying that when you posit, the point that I'm trying to put out there is that when you include miracles, when you include something that can just bend and twist reality as we know it, that we can explain things that when we can explain anything this way. And the important part about this is that we're not just explaining what we observe, but we're also explaining things that we wouldn't expect to observe, and we're explaining things that would contradict the observations that we have. Like all these things together means that what you're positing as an explanation for those things becomes a really bad explanation, because I can use exactly the same arguments and explain like they said, like the counterfactual to that, and still have exactly the same amount of veracity to that claim with the same amount of support for that claim as I would for what you're invoking when you're trying to explain something in the Bible.
But I see what my friend is saying. Converse. I mean, yeah, if you're granting us God, period, that by definition is an unexplainable thing. That is a miracle. He's a walking miracle. So to just then change the rules and say, well, this walking miracle cannot do miracles for you can't use him as a miracle maker as an explanation. I mean, that's like saying, well, if there's a bat and there's a baseball and there's a guy named Miracle, if he hits the ball out of the stadium, and you say, well, you can't explain it by miracle. You can only explain the bat and the ball. How did the bat and the ball, cause the ball to just go out the stadium? I'm going to say, well, the guy named Miracle, he's the one that hit it. I mean, he used the bat and he also hit the ball. So I can explain the ball and the bat within the realms of science, but this person, he's a miracle. He did that. So that's what's happening. You want us to exclude the very thing that you granted us, which is God, who does miracles.
It's not that I'm excluding it. We're talking about the weakness of an argument. We're talking about whether or not that argument or the proposition that you're putting forward contains, what we would consider explanatory value. Okay, so let's take a look at something like the fine-tuning argument. Okay, where they say this, like, well, look at the universe the way that it is. That the likelihood of life is so unlikely that there has to be, for life to exist where it is now, it could only be possible because of a God. Mm-hmm. And that is explained through the existence of a God. But if a God existed, a God could also create a universe that was totally tuned for life. And if we lived in that possible reality where the universe was tuned for life, we could say, well, look at this. The universe is tuned for life. Therefore, God exists. We can take a look at the human body. We can say, like, well, look at the human body and how complex it is. And complexity is a sign of design. But then you could also take a look and be like, well, let's imagine we live in a world where the human body was incredibly simple. And you can say, well, look at how simple the human body is. And simplicity is a symbol of design as well. Mm-hmm. The point is that, like, when you posit an explanation that can explain something as well as the counterfactual to that thing, what does that point actually explain? Because you posit an entity that explains everything, then all of a sudden it weakens any explanation that you're going to put forward.
Well, I have to disagree with you about the counterfactual, though, because, for example, I wouldn't run the argument that way. I'd say something more like, okay, well, if there was this God that created, created the universe, a multiverse for human life, for example, we would expect there would be, for example, orderly laws of nature. There would be things would be ordered, for example. And
sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off there. You're putting what we observe as something that we expect. Like, but there's nothing inconsistent with saying that if an omnipotent being did exist, that we could also live in a chaotic universe.
Well, that's what I was about to say next, was that the counterfactual of an orderly universe would be a universe that was not ordered, right? And I would just simply say something like, well, if a designer created the atmosphere or the universe, for example, for life to flourish, then we would expect an orderly universe. And then I would, you could run a parallel argument that we would not expect a chaotic universe, for example, for life to flourish, because there could be people popping into existence and then popping out in the next second, or there could be, fire just popping into somebody's home, for example, at any point, or chaotic things do not promote, an atmosphere for life, for example. You could just run a parallel argument on that.
Right, but you're saying that a chaotic universe that could not be brought about by an omnipotent God?
I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying that we wouldn't expect a chaotic universe that doesn't. And I'm saying if
Why wouldn't we expect that?
If on the God model, if we expect a God, for example, well, we have to take what we expect. So if we expect a God that created the universe for life to flourish, for example, then we would expect that it would be orderly for the flourishing of the human, or for the life.
So
But
I'm going to cut in a little bit. This is, I've waited very patiently, but the problem is that if a God were to create a universe that is, good for life to flourish, it would not look very much like ours. I mean,
well, I can agree
granted,
with
the
that.
particular laws of physics that exist eventually can allow for life, but that doesn't mean that it's anywhere close to fine-tuned for it.
Yeah, but I could totally agree with that. And the theological perspective just says something like humans lived in a place that the Bible calls Eden. Now, whatever that is, that'll be a theological view. But that humans were expelled because of some circumstances that occurred, and then that the earth, they were banished to the earth, to a cursed world that brought up thorns and thistles, for example, and things like that. So anything that you can run and say, well, hang on a second, because this isn't necessarily orderly. Think about cancer, think about wisdom teeth, think about all these different things.
I'm not even talking about orderly. I'm talking about the idea of fine tuning. Like, granted, again, this
Right.
universe, because we are here, we are life, and we are talking, it obviously allows for life, but the vast majority
Sure.
of the universe is completely inhospitable to it. Beyond that, though, I want to backtrack to something else. You believe your God is omnipotent, and yet you were talking about a chaotic universe and how a chaotic universe would not be sustainable for life. But would a God that is omnipotent not be able to create life that would be ideally suited for a chaotic universe? So your entire argument there does not make sense.
In fact,
What was your claim about the?
If the universe itself was chaotic and life somehow managed to exist, that would be a better, I would say that would be a stronger example of the existence of a God, explained by the existence of a God. Like, look at how chaotic this universe is, but yet life manages to exist. Like, that would be,
but
you could put forward that idea and it would make more sense.
Well, and not only that, though, if we were the life in that chaotic universe, though, that chaos would be as normal to us as order currently is. Like, we have a hard time understanding what life would look like in a so-called chaotic universe, using the Greek definition of chaos, literally anything can happen. And yet an omnipotent deity would create life that would be adapted to that universe. So they would have a hard time understanding how life could exist in an ordered universe.
Well, there were 3 points there, so I'll try and backtrack. One, I would say this last claim that chaotic universe would become normal to us the way, but on your own admission from that definition, chaotic universe means that literally anything can happen. I don't see how that could become ordinary. Anything can happen at any point, so I would disagree with that. And then there's the other claim that, well, hold on a second, because if an omnipotent creator created this, it's all powerful, it could bring, it would be more godly to bring life out of chaos. For example, that's what the Bible says, that in the beginning that God took the void, the chaos, and create and ordered it. So that is a claim made, and so I would just point to that. And then I don't remember your first point.
I don't understand
Kelly.
why an omnipotent God, why it would, why they would necessarily make a universe more orderly. An omnipotent God would be capable of, creating life in a perfectly chaotic universe. And again, we come back to a timeless, omnipotent, omniscient, etc. God would have no reason for anything, which I don't recall if you were actually a part of that section of the discussion, but timelessness basically strips away reasons. It strips away any sort of capability of.
How do you know that?
Well, for one thing, because of the studies that we have done that showcase exactly how decisions are made. As evolved beings, we can only make decisions in relation to time. Without time, there is no decision, because time is change.
Right, but that would be an argument from ignorance to say because of what we don't know what that we don't know what could happen outside of time. I mean,
I never said we don't know what could happen outside of time. I said time is change. Anything that changes would create time. So therefore,
Right, but
timelessness would be a state of no change. So nothing could be created by a timeless God.
well, like for example, just take somebody like William Lane Craig, who a lot of people don't respect for necessarily, but like he studied time for 11 years, and so like I'm not qualified as he is to talk about these issues, for example. But like if you take somebody like himself, and then I think we're also assuming the A theory of time here. Am I right about that? Because if
This isn't an assumption. This is the way that time is actually
what
defined.
about the B theory of time though? It's not in the same passage of time as the A theory. So I don't think that would actually
but
work
even
on the B theory.
yeah, but even though William Lane Craig says that he could potentially work out the Kalam on a B theory of time, he doesn't.
Well, no,
like
he doesn't use the B theory.
Yeah, he uses A theory. Yeah, one
Right.
of the biggest counters that people have put forward for his argument is on a B theory of time. Every single moment past eternal is just as just as relevant as like the moment right now. Like that,
Right.
it's So they that an infinite time bubble, so they speak about it, would have no need for something to Kalam.
Exactly, but his argument against it is merely that it's not intuitive. So in that sense, I don't think that obviously he doesn't think that he has a knockdown argument against it. He just says, appeal to your own intuition and see if that makes sense to you.
Yeah,
Now I don't have a
whenever-
lot of time left, so I mean I only got a few
Okay.
minutes, but I'll try and answer as many as I can. And Justin, if I'm taking up a lot of time, sorry about that, man. I didn't mean to
No, you're
kind of
doing
take
good.
over.
Well, I jokingly said we can go to 12:30 in the chat, but I do need to try to close it out by midnight. And CC, this is why I wanted to have you on, because you have good arguments, and they usually come from good literature. So I appreciate you coming on. Feel free to dip out when you want, and come back on another time.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me. Like I say, I'm in a very rare state on YouTube because I had left for so long and came back. I kind of missed some of these squabbles that were going on, and so I'm picking up the clicks again. I actually remember Justin from way back. I was on YouTube and Google Plus back with the Google Hangouts and G Plus, and you were on there. Your name was different, but it was just you were going by your name, I think, Justin Wilson. But
Yeah.
you were in a lot of Hangouts with me and Evangelist Ken and a lot of those guys back then. But it's been 4 years, so I'm sure you probably 3 or 4 years. I'm sure you probably don't remember that, but anyway, yeah, I appreciate you even considering to have me on. And again, I'm in a rare form here because I find a lot of atheists appreciating the fact that I'm taking their argument seriously, and that I don't just go, well, it's just a stupid argument to get out of believing in God. Like I do take argument, like for example, the Pascal's wager. Like people ask me, like, well, what's the worst argument for God? Like I think Pascal's wager is, because it's not even a good argument, and I'll admit things like that right up front. But I do buy into a lot of what the main core doctrines of Christianity are. I just have a different approach. I don't buy the old way of getting to that. So that's I've been
For what it's worth,
accepted
by the
both.
way, you and I discussing, I'm actually a theist, if you didn't catch that earlier.
Yeah, I
So-
did. Thought I heard that you were a pagan. I just had a conversation
Yes.
with my friend Ocean the other day. So he was on my channel, and he is as well. And I'm sure you probably know him from YouTube.
Oh yeah, Ocean is actually a friend of mine as well. He and I met through Surus.
Okay.
So
Yeah,
I came over into Atheist Tube from Left Tube. I was good friends with Pig Puncher, and Pig Puncher introduced me to Surus, and Surus introduced me to Knock. But I'm a Hellenic polytheist, so I'm different.
Oh, okay,
He's a heathen.
I actually asked him about the Hellenic polytheism, and we had a conversation on my channel. I don't know, a week or so ago, and I asked him about. He's like, "Look, I don't know that much about Hellenism, honestly. I'm more in the. He's more in the heathen. Is it?
Heathenry is
forget
an
what the-
accurate name for it.
Okay, yeah. I was thinking more
Norris.
something more specific. Yeah, Norris.
that's
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, Norse
It's
Reconstructions.
hipster paganism. Hipster
Right.
paganism. Like,
Right.
you know,
Exactly.
I'll
beards
tell
and skinny
you,
jeans.
I'll tell you what I like immediately liked about UCC and some of the Christians I'm starting to meet now is you do have normal Christian beliefs. So like we would disagree about a lot, but you don't judge me. You never look down on me for being a raging atheist. You treated me the same. And I just don't get that from too many Christians. Both times Justin's been on my channel, he's been the same. It's been very civil discourses and conversations, and that's what I appreciate, because too often I think Christians come on here trying to trigger me because I was easily triggered last year. But I
Get a
really
rise out of
appreciate
you.
civil conversations.
Well, I actually, like I said earlier on, like when we were talking about is Christianity helpful? That's one claim, but like I would rather know, like, is it true, for example? And so if I hear an argument against Christianity, I want to know it because I want to know, is there something I'm missing? For example, a lot of people will tell me, they go, okay, well, what about this claim in the Bible? Like, what if this doesn't meet up with modern science or something like that? For example, and I like to tell them, well, think about a claim from the Bible, like God has the number of hairs on your head numbered. Now, if he were to told the ancient Israelites, I have all the molecules in your DNA strand numbered, they wouldn't have wrote it down because they would have thought God was just some crazy voice in their head. They'd be like, I don't know what God was talking about. So I think God reveals things to people in a way that they can comprehend, but also in a way that it can be read later and made sense of. So, for example, he may have said something like the circle of the earth or something like that, and then the ancient Hebrew, I can even give you that they might have thought something different. Like they might have thought the earth was circular and had like a dome or something like that. That doesn't matter to me, because I can concede that they might have had a flawed understanding of some scientific premise. It makes sense, obviously, but that does not lend credibility to the fact that the Bible may be that the God that revealed things is incorrect. And so I would just say that with a lot of things. For example, like with morality, God might have, there's a biblical principle that God tries to wean people like off of things. Like God, you give milk to the babes, and then you give meat to people when they're ready to eat meat. For example, a lot of people like to point to Old Testament passages, and then I like to say, well, why did Christ point to those same passages and say, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, it hasn't been that way from the beginning. What he's basically saying, he's given tacit approval to the fact that, like, for example, Christ will say, Moses gave you that law because of the hardness of your heart. Like, he's basically saying, you guys were barbarians, you're barbaric, and God gave, and Moses gave you certain laws because of how hard your heart were, because of how barbaric you were, but it was not that way from the beginning. So that's the approach I like to take to things like that, is that you got to be willing to look back at their point of view and their perspective.
So you did say one thing that I always like to kind of address, which is that, like, you talk about Pascal wagers and said that Pascal wagers not you think it's like the worst argument for God. What do you think?
Just
the
so you
best
guys
argument?
know, I'm going to be having to get out of here fairly soon as well,
Yeah, I gotta
because
roll
we've got
in a minute.
Yeah,
we've got snow coming like for the rest of this week, and my area is basically a single snowflake falls and we're so ill-equipped that all the schools get shut down. So there's a very good chance that I live on top of a giant hill. None of my streets are going to get plowed. We need to go and try to pick some stuff up at the store before the snow starts falling.
Definitely.
So yeah.
Well, thanks
so just,
for the conversation.
Yeah. So just to that point, I have to get out here as well.
Yeah, I think it's a bad argument. It's just
I would love to.
Go ahead.
Oh, I agree. It's a bad argument. I would love to sit down, maybe on Rage's channel next week, and like discuss like one of the arguments that you think is a good argument for God.
Well, here's one thing that's different with me between me and other Christians. Or I don't take arguments and put a lot of stock in one argument. For example, What I like to do is I like to find out, what do you mean by evidence? So, for example, when I was talking with Steve McCrae, for example, which I know a lot of atheists don't like, so don't give me crap about mentioning him, but when I was talking to him, for example, I said, wouldn't you agree with me that evidence means something like, given a fact or some evidence, some body of facts or something, that it makes a claim more probable given those things or that thing than not having that thing. That would be, a roundabout evidential definition. And Steve
I would just
he critiqued it a little bit, but he agreed that given something about like that adds to its credibility, does provide evidence for it, whether it's good evidence or little evidence. And then I would
yeah.
run some. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I would say that. Yeah, like I'm okay with that. I figure when somebody talks about evidence, it's always just like evidence is always the supporting anything that supports an argument. Okay,
Sure.
so like, and just by the loosest of definition, is that if you're positing this, evidence would be anything that you could put forward that could support that, and I like that, and that works. But then we would also understand that there's a standard to evidence. Like that, if we can say that something that's good evidence or that's bad evidence, that's automatically assuming that there's some type of metric in which we can take a look at something being considered good or bad evidence. So, for example, something that would be considered bad evidence would be something that, like I said, like the what I said earlier, the universe could only be the universe. God must exist because the universe is fine tuned. But then again, like if the universe wasn't fine tuned, you could also use God as an example there. So like that's an example where just like,
yeah, but I think that God would be less probable given a non-fine-tuned universe, for example.
No, I think that I don't think that you could put any type of probabilistic outcome on it. I think that it would explain both points. So like that's why I said that the addition of God as an explanation, I never think there's a really strong one. But I'm willing to be like to be challenged on that.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you want to have. So if you want to have a discussion with Raging, just going over what we can consider good evidence for God, I would love to have that discussion.
Well, typically, the reason why I like to put it that way is because typically atheists, not all the time, obviously, I don't like to group, but a lot of times, or not a lot of times, I should say, sometimes atheists and agnostics will say something like, well, there is zero evidence for God. And in fact, a lot of will say that's their definition of atheism, is that by atheist, I mean there is no evidence for God. And so I'd like to start with, well, do you agree with me on the definition of atheism, that anything that adds to the proposition being more probable exist as evidence? And then they say yes, and then I can say, well, good evidence or bad evidence. Take, for example, this argument or something, and then I would try to go from there. So I don't. Only thing I'm pointing out is I don't try to put stock in any evidence. I mean, any argument as the argument. So, for example, the Kalam, it may be a valid and sound argument, or as Dragnauct slipped up and said the other day, a salad argument, sound and valid. But
salad, it's a short way to put it. Yeah.
Right, exactly. That he slipped up and said that, and he goes, I mean, sound and valid. But anyway, so I don't use any of those arguments as like a proof text, for example, or a proof argument, but rather I would use other claims to evidence, and then I would just, based on the person I'm speaking to's reason, say, would you not consider that, if not only little evidence, wouldn't you not consider that as evidence at all? And yeah, I'd be willing to have a conversation with you guys, but typically the weekends aren't good for me. I spend the weekends with my son and fiance, so Tuesday through Thursday are the best times for me. But I am going back to finish my degree. I'm starting back school next week, so try to catch me Tuesday through Thursday, but I'm going to be more limited going forward.
Yeah, we can work.
Well, I can tell you,
between
from the 20th until the 31st of January, I'm actually off work on vacation, so I'm pretty much available in that entire time.
If Tony Designs is still in the chat, Tony and MathPig run my Discord. Just send Socka my Discord, and then
I'm in your Discord.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah, I just don't
for some reason
participate.
I was thinking you might have been, but all right. So yeah, just hit me up on Discord. Send me a message or something whenever you're available, and I'll let you know what my best times are.
Awesome, sounds good. And not the
Oh yeah. Yeah,
I use
I'm
your channel.
totally down for that.
And you too, Justin. Feel free to hit me up. Naka, you already got all my information, and Ellie as well. I'm pretty available. Find me on Twitter as well or whatever. So
Okay.
I do live streams, like I typically do them once or twice a week. So
On YouTube or?
yeah, on YouTube I open up. A lot of times I'll do a debate or I'll do a chat, and then I'll open up a live stream afterwards, an after show, and just allow anybody who wants to come in.
What's your name again?
Converse Contender.
Oh, that's right.
Like conversation contender, like what we're doing now, contending in conversation. So
Yeah, it's a good channel. I think it's gonna grow. I usually will catch the streams after work when you have them.
yeah, I
at least
appreciate
part of
that.
it.
I've
Yeah.
definitely had a wonderful time talking with you, Converse. It was nice to meet you.
Me too. I really appreciate all the support and encouragement. I acknowledge that I could be wrong. I take kind of a fallibilism point of view. If you
So
guys
do
are
I.
never, okay, I was about to say, if you've never looked up the term fallibilism, like that's the type of view I take. So, but I just think that a lot of times both sides do it wrong. I think both sides typically do the conversation the wrong way. So.
Oh yeah, I agree.
Well, at that point, we can agree as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, perfect.
Right, yeah.
So that might actually be a good point to end on.
Yeah, I know. I've got to go to sleep myself.
Yeah.
Justin, yeah, please come back on. Both times you've been on, they've been interesting conversations. I was tired to start the stream, man, I'm tired. So I'll give people final words, and yeah, we'll get out of here, and we'll do this definitely again, and we'll work that out between Socka and Converse. I'd love to host that.
Thanks for having me.
Yes.
Oh, Jill coming up. Tony's not even here anymore, and I think Jill's getting all timed out.
Don't worry. The entire mod team knows to time him out.
Yeah. Oh, Jill. All right, so yeah, any final words? Socka, thank you so much, man. It's been too long. Really glad you and Drag came back on. Missed these old. It felt like an old stream again, even though I wasn't partaking too much. I enjoyed it. It was fun.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate it. I'm going to have to drop right now as well because I got to get out of here before the weather gets too bad as well.
Before you go, Soccer, by the way, the chat noticed apparently I'd been cutting you off a great deal tonight. I hope that I haven't been too terrible. When we stream late, my medication starts to kick out, and I'm really, really sorry.
It's not a problem. You know
what?
what? It's I view it as karma for the years and years of hangouts where I did it to other people. And as Naka points out, sometimes you got to interrupt Soccer because once I go, it takes 30 minutes for me to stop.
It's a discussion, not a dissertation.
Yeah. So I'm okay with it. But on that note, I'm good. Thanks for hosting me. And I will just message me on Twitter or in Discord at my Bartholomew Roberts account if anybody wants to chat.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Socka. Thank you, Justin. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and just cut it to the closing scene. Thank you, Allie, for... we went pretty longer than we usually go tonight. Thank you guys for being here. It was a great discussion. Covered a lot of ground. We'll see you soon.
Cool.